Okay, so climate change impacts are already here, and impacts on health are fairly serious. And of course, there are confounding factors like people's movements, habitation loss, and zoonotic and vector-borne diseases, and then warming, floods, droughts, and so on that we have been looking at. Altogether, there is always a great need to assess the need for adaptation and options, and they have to be done at scale, as we have seen. So we'll look at some principles that are from various reports and papers. So, assuming a vulnerability assessment identified how the current burden of climate related health outcomes could change with climate change over specific temporal and spatial scales. The main steps in conducting an adaptation assessment include these. So we will look again at vulnerability assessment. We have already looked at it, and mapping vulnerability is a key factor. But once that is done, adaptation has to respond to that because you want to reduce vulnerability, reduce risk, and increase resilience, right? So the assessments should include evaluating the effectiveness of policies and measures to reduce the current burden of climate-sensitive health outcomes. So we need to know the baseline of where we stand now. Identifying adaptation options to manage the health risks of current and projected climate change. So what's happening now and how the risk can be immediately reduced for current situations, as well as what are the longer term projected climate change impacts on health risks. Evaluating and prioritizing adaptation options. Identifying human and financial resources needs and options to overcome possible barriers, constraints, and limits to implementation. Developing monitoring and evaluation programs to facilitate continued effectiveness of policies and measures in a changing climate. So adaptation means dealing with changes that are already here, but this doesn't mean you cannot worry about the future. You have to continue to evaluate and make plans for how climate change impacts are going to keep changing over time, because you want to avoid maladaptation. If you plan only for the present and make big investments in infrastructure, training, etc., then if it turns out to be not good for the future, then you have a serious issue of maladaptation, and there are some very good papers on maladaptation as well. Under the IPCC UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which global negotiations happen, there are requirements for national adaptation plans, and the typology of this is that is something like this. This is the national adaptation plan processes. So there are implementation strategies that feed to reporting, monitoring, and review, so that metrics are set up to assess progress. And there are various steps or elements in the National Assessment Plan technical guidelines, which we will not go into here. You can look those up, but you can see some here. A is laying the groundwork and addressing the gaps. B is preparatory elements. C is implementation strategies, and D is reporting, monitoring, and review. And the diagram here schematically shows planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation with enabling factors like financing, institutional arrangements, information sharing, and capacity development. Okay, so these are kind of typologies under which these things are supposed to happen. Under IPCC, the adaptation needs and options include considerations like effectiveness in reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience, efficiency, increased benefits and reduce costs, equitable, especially to vulnerable groups, mainstreamed, integrated with broader social goals, programs, and activities, stakeholder participation, engagement, and support, so co-production that we talked about before to make the adaptation options and strategies usable, useful, and used so that people are involved in the system development, consistent with social norms and tradition, which makes it very local and region specific, legitimacy and social acceptability. If that is not there, then it'll be seen as an external imposition and the usefulness and usability will be reduced. Implementation will be difficult. Sustainable, environmental and institutional sustainabilities are good consideration. Flexible and responsive to feedback and learning, so there should be a feedback process. Designed for an appropriate scope and time frame, okay, to be adaptable to a changing climate. Likely to avoid maladaptive traps, what we said before. Robust against a wide range of climate and social scenarios. We talked about RCPs and SSPs. Resources available, including information, finance, leadership, and management capacity. Need for transformative changes considered. Coherence and synergy with other objectives such as mitigation. So mitigation should not contradict adaptation and vice versa. So there should be coherence and synergy across these. There are many national climate assessments which do not always explicitly include health outcomes or health risks, but for each health outcome, in keeping with the framework set out for the national assessment as a whole, the health impacts assessment sought to address a set of questions by the study that Christy Abbey was involved in. How might climate change affect the country's health and existing or predicted stresses on health? What is the country's capacity to adapt to climate change, for example, through modifications to the health infrastructure or by adopting specific adaptive mechanisms? What essential knowledge gaps must be filled to understand fully the possible impacts of climate variability and change on human health? So climate assessments have become part of the IPCC, which does global assessments, and then there are regional assessments done. And health assessment has to be now tacked onto that to make plans for not only climate change adaptation and mitigation, but also health adaptation and mitigation. Okay, so I will come to typologies of adaptations in the next podcast. One has to consider whether the health adaptation will be just to deal with avoiding immediate risks and reducing immediate vulnerabilities, or it will try to transform the system or at least transition adaptation strategies towards a transformative change for dealing with climate change on a longer term in terms of its impact on health and health vulnerabilities and risks. Okay, so those are very different, but one has to be aware of how to accomplish those. Sometimes maybe immediate transition adaptation may be needed, but it has to be adaptive to deal with transformations needed as climate change impacts begin to get worse in certain locations or in certain communities, even certain neighborhoods of a particular city, for example. Okay, we'll do that in the next podcast.